Hello and welcome. My name is Florian Meyer, and together with my colleague Tuan Boris, we supervised Amelia in her master thesis, where she studied temporary switching behavior between mobile messenger services. So what might people motivate to use multiple mobile messenger services alongside each other? The overall theme has been also in the media lately, where you can see that a lot of people moved from WhatsApp and downloaded other mobile messenger services like Signal or Telegram, in this case because of security or privacy issues. But in our study, we didn't actually focus on permanent switching behavior, basically app abandonment, what would be the case here with WhatsApp, but we focused on temporary switching behavior. As I said, this means using multiple messenger services side by side. We picked mobile messaging services because they are just simply the most popular app category, enabling communication between people or groups of people, where you can also send not only text, but of course also different types of media, smileys, videos, links, and so on and so on. And how and why users adopt new mobile messenger services and abandon other apps and older mobile messenger services has been studied in detail. But temporary switching between mobile messenger services. So why would people choose to have like 5 to 10 different of mobile messenger services installed with the fact that actually they also offer similar functionality? And why would they use those side by side? And what causes to switch back and forth between those hasn't been studied before. As I already mentioned, there has been studies that investigate what might be people driving away or from older apps and attracting and pulling to new apps in that sense, or what factors might be mediating between those reasons, which has been studied using, for example, the push-pull mooring framework. And there has been studies also quite recently do that. Another very interesting and relevant background for us is, for example, the use of SMS. Church and Oliveira in 2013 already studied why people would switch between WhatsApp and SMS, and they found 8 driving factors. And they also found out that WhatsApp, for example, was used for longer conversations with friends and family, while SMS was seen to be more formal but also more privacy preserving and reliable. Kramer and Jacobs, 2015, they studied, for example, how couples would use different kind of forms of communication, also SMS and also social media, but also, for example, notes. And they found out that partner's preference plays a big role in switching between different kind of communication channels. In Nuance, 2017, they studied mobile messaging services from the perspective of communication places and how they play a role in their personal ecosystem. So how did we approach this question of what actually are motivations for switching between mobile messenger services? So Zhou and Hong, 2015, they suggested that capturing this dynamic nature of mobile messaging can only be done by collecting longitudinal data. And that's why also we decided to collect longitudinal data in the form of a diary study. In order to contextualize our diaries, we performed pre and post diary study interviews in order to also do some within method triangulation in the end. The concrete study background looked like this. So the time frame was that the diary lasted for 5 days, 3 weekdays and a weekend. And at the end of every day, like at 9 o'clock, every participant got a Google Forms sent that they could fill out. That looked something like this. In that Google Forms, we had a lot of different questions, also collected quantitative and qualitative data. For example, with how many individual persons did they communicate and how many different services did they use, and so on and so on. The participants in our study were purposefully sampled. So we had 10 participants, 5 male and 5 female. We selected them specifically from a certain age range between 20 and 30, because that's what we thought was that age range where people would be also more up to using multiple messenger services at the same time. All our people were Danish citizens or living in Denmark at that time. Here, a quick overview over the popularity of the mobile messenger services among our study participants. We can see that Facebook Messenger and iMessage were almost used by every participant, and were also mostly used for sending messages. But other than that, there was also a kind of a broad variety of different apps that our participants had installed. We have a quite strong bias towards Apple products. That is something that we need to acknowledge, because this is also in Denmark, Apple products are very popular among the public. Our responses from the surveys and also the qualitative comments in the diaries were analyzed in some kind of thematic analysis with 3 or actually 2 coding phases and a third grouping of codes. In an open coding phase, we did an inductive development of codes based on textual data from the diaries and interviews, as I mentioned, based on the 5 participants. So we didn't integrate all of them at the beginning, but to developing the codes, of course. And then we did also some actual coding where we had an affinity diagram and we identified relationships between codes, rearranged codes also into higher level categories. And in the end, we tried to perform a grouping as well. The result of that qualitative data analysis was a coding scheme with 4 different main factors, and those main factors also had 3 levels of granularity, as we will see in a bit. And I'll present to you the results of the qualitative data analysis now. So the first category was technological affordances. And as you can see here, it also has those 3 sub-levels, basically. Technological affordances revolved around, for example, features and functionalities that people would like or dislike, and that's why they would switch or avoid using a certain MMS, or, for example, the user experience. Yeah, if we look at the category no phone number here, for example, then one of our participants said, for WhatsApp, you need to have someone's number. I don't like to share my number all the time, but with Messenger, you only need someone's name, and it's also easier to block people. So that would be basically a motivation for them in that context to switch to Messenger instead of using WhatsApp. And another participant said, I think it has something to do with a link on Messenger. Then it comes up with a small preview, where on iMessage, it's just a link. So it's basically the functionality of the preview that they liked, why they would switch in that context, and why they would prefer that in that context. Other contextual factors were the second biggest category. You see the 3 main factors here are cultural influence, social factors, and situational factors. Among the social factors, probably the most frequent ones were about the closeness of relationships and also the knowledge of other users and preferences. For example, people would say that for remote acquaintances like this, it is common to exchange numbers and use SMS. It's also funny to note here that contradiction to the other person before, who would actually say, no, I don't want to exchange my numbers. But maybe this is also then a kind of a bit of a generation thing or personal preference as well, which is one of the reasons that we're gonna discuss last. Another aspect that was mentioned is, I think it has something to do with the fact that my partner is extremely busy, so it has been like short SMS coordinating. Yeah, he doesn't have time to be on social media. So again, here you could say this is something related to a partner's preferences or the communication partner's preferences in that case. And in this situation, it's both more like a situational and a social factor. So note that basically those quotes could not only be coded with one code, but could also have multiple codes attached. Speaking of the closeness and the preference of our participants or the preference of what mobile messenger service that they might be using, we asked for every participant that for each participant and the persons that they communicated with what was the relationship of closeness via the iOS scale. Was it either low, medium, or high? So were they highly close, or was it were they distant people or distant persons? Or and it's interesting to note that, of course, still you see that Facebook Messenger and iMessage are the most used messenger services, but the more distant the relationship is, the more frequently SMS also gets used. Another important factor was the type of conversation. So the type of conversation could be, for example, the topic or activity that people were performing, or for example, also the duration. So as you can note here, planning and events was among the most frequently mentioned reasons for why people would switch between one or the other messenger service. And this becomes also evident in this quote. We started the conversation on Instagram, but I switched to Messenger because we were going to plan to meet, and Instagram doesn't feel right to communicate important things on. So it basically becomes clear here from that quote that yeah, for them, some messenger services, they don't they are not associated with being serious enough, you could say, to be able to plan events on. So they would probably prefer another one. So they would switch also within conversations and not only yeah, outside conversations between different messenger services like this one here. This example shows. Another example like this shows that I chose to write an SMS as we were going to coordinate a time to meet tomorrow. Like again, you can see that for certain tasks that people wanted to perform, for example, planning an events as planning an activity here, they might switch to something that could be considered more reliable as well. The second part of type of conversation, which was also the most frequently mentioned reason for why they would switch between messenger services, is group conversations here mentioned. And one of the quotes that underlines this is, if just one person doesn't have an iPhone, then you can't make group conversations, and then you will receive a bunch of individual messages as if it was a group conversation. It's a mess sometimes, it's awfully annoying. Again, I want to highlight that, of course, group conversation is one of the reasons, but another reason or another code that got assigned here was, of course, the user experience code from our first factors that we got introduced earlier. The second quote that I brought here is, I commented on his Instagram story and then the conversation started from there. So basically, actually the initiation of the discussion happened somewhere else, but then people moved on and choose another messenger to continue the conversation there. Finally, people would have a lot of individual preferences on why they would switch between certain mobile messaging services. One of them might be privacy issues or financial costs, but as you can see, privacy was not that often mentioned by our participants. However, what was quite frequently mentioned is that the switching between a certain mobile messaging service or between two mobile messenger services was influenced by the habit. So just like we used to do it every day, communicating with that service. So that's why we just stuck to it. And this can also be seen on this quote here. You grow up with the standard SMS service. It's the one you feel kind of safe about. So it's been always like this. That's why they continue to do that. And along the same lines are the other two comments here. That's just what we have done. It's actually weird. So it's also basically people don't really reflect that much on their behavior. It's just something that is ingrained in them and they continue to do that. As also shows the last one. This is where we usually communicate. So to sum up, what have we learned today? We learned that temporary switching between mobile messenger services is influenced by 4 main types of factors. The most frequently one, and now I'm going from the ones that were most frequently mentioned or assigned, basically codes assigned to those frequently mentioned reasons, is the type of conversation, which means that group conversations for planning and events were the ones that were most frequently mentioned. And the second one would be technological affordances. So the second one is basically most frequently mentioned one, technical affordances. Positive UX would influence the switching behavior, which means that unique and well-defined features might motivate them to temporarily switch to MMS, as we could see with the link example. But the interesting thing that we noted is that negative user experience does not necessarily lead to abandonment. So if important social contexts keep using it, we haven't really gotten into detail into that. You can read that in the paper, but this is something that we actually noticed that not necessarily does negative user experience lead to someone deleting or abandoning an app if they still communicate with persons on there. The third one was then contextual factors. Closeness and social ties play an important role between temporary switching. So it was said that SMS was used for urgent notifications and also for distant acquaintances. And then finally, individual preferences were the ones that got mentioned, but of course the least ones, as they're ranked here fourth. But people's habits and routines still, they have a strong hold over the choice that of the mobile messaging services that they're using. Finally, I want to go back to also the title of the paper. They each have their forte, so which was basically something that one of the participants mentioned. They said that they all have somewhat kind of their advantage, and it's not that easy to just get rid of one and just focus on the other one, or basically focus on only having one. Because they would rather install additional apps and have them side by side. And it's more likely that they do that than to permanently abandon another app. We also asked participants whether it would be interesting for them to have like an app that would synchronize among all MMS, but this was also something that was not necessarily desired that much. So they would probably still prefer to use multiple messenger services alongside each other. Yeah, now I've come to the end of my talk. If you have any questions, then feel free to ask in the Q&A session. Thank you for your attention.